Number 34th meeting of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. I'd like to remind committee members, as well as those who have joined us, that today's meeting will be televised and will be made available on the House of Commons website. For the first hour of our meeting today, pursuant to the Standing Order 81.4, we are examining the main estimates of 2021-22. Votes number 1 and 5 under the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Canada. Today, our witnesses for the first hour, and to be joined, actually joining us for the second hour, some of them will remain here for the second hour for our second, technically our second meeting in the second hour of today's meeting, but for our first hour, for sure, is from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. We've got Daryl Theron, who is the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. We've got Brent Holman, who is the Deputy Commissioner of Compliance Section. We've got Daniel Nadeau, who is the Deputy Commissioner of Corporate Management Section. And we've got, I believe, Gregory Smolnik, who is the Deputy Commissioner of Policy and Promotion Section. He wasn't here just moments ago, but may have joined us. If he hasn't yet, he will be joining us. Commissioner, I'm going to turn it over to you for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You can hear me?
I can very well. Thank you.
Alors, bonjour, Monsieur le Président et Mesdames et Messieurs.
Hello, good morning, Chair and members of the committee. I'm very pleased to meet with you for the next 2 hours to discuss our 21-22 main estimates, our activities in general, and then the fundamental issue of facial recognition. All of this, of course, in a context where a very important bill, C-11, has been introduced in the House of Commons. Last year was one of transition as we quickly shifted to adapt, as many other agencies did, to be able to continue to serve Canadians during the pandemic. It was also a year of transition on the budgetary and legislative fronts. Our office received a permanent increase of 15% in the 2019 federal budget to address the most urgent needs of the OPC pending legislative reform. This increase allowed our office to expand our policy and guidance functions, to enhance our advisory services for organizations, and to address pressures resulting from new mandatory breach reporting requirements in the private sector. We also received temporary funding to help us reduce a very large part of our investigative backlog complaints older than a year. On that front, we met and even surpassed our target and reduced the overall backlog by 91%. So we're very pleased with that result. Over the past year, our work has included the publication of guidance on protecting privacy during a pandemic, as well as a contextual framework for government institutions to protect privacy in the context of COVID-19 initiatives. Consistent with this framework, we reviewed and advised the government on the COVID Alert app. Following a public consultation, we released key recommendations for regulating artificial intelligence. And we also produced our first reports on breach records inspections. In addition, we analyzed and provided recommendation on several legislative initiatives. This includes a submission on the statutory review of access to the Access to Information Act and another submission on the modernizing of the Public Sector Privacy Act. And that was, there was a consultation by the Department of Justice. Finally, we conducted a detailed analysis of Bill C-11. All these documents, with the exception of our brief on C-11, are available on our website. While the injection of funds helped us to reduce our backlog and to increase our capacity, there is still a very significant gap. Given the marked acceleration of digitization caused by the pandemic, we continue to struggle meeting the demand in guidance, advisory work, and to assist our investigators to address complaints filed by concerned Canadians. In the government's fall economic update, funds were allocated to support the implementation and enforcement of Bill C-11. This is, of course, a good thing. However, now that we know the extent of our new responsibilities under this legislation, we believe additional funding will be required.
Imposes several new responsibilities on the OPC, including the obligation to review codes of practice and certification programs, and give advice to individual organizations on their privacy management programs. It should be noted that these are non-discretionary activities, meaning that every time an entity or organization will seek our advice or approval, we will be required to provide our considered opinion. We welcome the opportunity to work with business. In recent years, I have restructured my office towards a greater proactive approach to guide and engage with organizations toward compliance with the law. We created 2 new directorates to engage proactively with private and public sector organizations on a voluntary basis on privacy risks of a high impact nature. These activities have increased during the pandemic. Actually, they've been very popular. As you know, another role we play is to investigate complaints alleging violations of the Act. However, it is not our only role, and in order to be an effective regulator, we must be able to be strategic in our enforcement and advisory activities, applying a risk-based approach. As we explain more fully in our submission on Bill C-11, we are concerned that with the non-discretionary nature of our responsibilities under that bill, we will not be able to both serve complainants and organizations and focus on harms to Canadians in general. The issue here is not primarily financial, although in our view, additional resources will be required. The OPC should have the legal discretion to manage its caseload, respond to the requests of organizations and complaints of consumers in the most effective and efficient way possible, and reserve a portion of our time for activities we initiate based on our assessment of risks for Canadians. Such discretion is enjoyed broadly by domestic and international regulatory partners, both within and outside the privacy protection sphere. Another option to balance our various activities could be ensuring the OPC's role of approving codes of practice and certification programs under the proposed Bill C-11 be conditional on the payment of a cost recovery fee to ensure that we have the capacity for that task as well as for our other priorities. No regulator ultimately has enough resources to handle all the requests it receives from citizens and regulated entities, and it is important that my office have the flexibility to allocate resources in ways that will offer the most benefits for Canadians and adjust activities to address new and emerging trends. In addition to changes brought by C-11 proposals, proposals made by the Department of Justice in its recent consultation on modernizing the Privacy Act, the Public Sector Act, would also see significant changes to our role in the public sector, of which we are largely supportive. This includes a new publication mandate, the power to issue guidance to government institutions, a role in issuing advance opinions and overseeing pilot projects, and greater discretion to publish compliance outcomes, among others. Justice's proposals also include an enhanced compliance role for our office, such as expanded proactive audit powers and a form of order making. We have already begun to plan for these eventualities. En conclusion, alors que nous nous tournons vers la
As we look to the future, it will be important that modern privacy laws allow us to act as an effective regulator. Our office should also be provided with the financial resources necessary to implement these laws. I look forward to working with Parliament on improving the legislative proposals to ensure our modern privacy laws adequately protect the privacy rights of Canadians while promoting responsible innovation. Thank you, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. We're going to begin with Mr. Carey. Dr. Carey, we'll begin with you for the first questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I want to really thank the witnesses for being here today. I've been looking forward to having you here. I do have a question. As you mentioned, this is an unprecedented time, and we are seeing more and more people working from home. I was just wondering if you were able to identify any efficiencies in the program delivery by having people work at home. Are you finding that things are working okay right now, or do you have something to suggest? Commissioner Thériault?
We efficiencies, not really due to the telework environment. I mean, we had to adjust very rapidly, obviously, to the telework environment, ensuring that our colleagues, our employees have the required technology to continue to provide their services. So there was no increased efficiency due to the pandemic, but there was no loss of efficiency either. There were efficiencies due to technology, regardless of the pandemic, in that, for instance, we used for the first time an electronic form for the filing of complaints leading to investigations, which allowed us to be more efficient in the first stages, the triage part of our investigations. So technology did help at the end of the day, yes.
Okay, so long term, do you see a significant impact on your resources? Do you think long term it will allow you to run things more efficiently?
Technology will certainly be part of the solution. We're working right now on a way to use technology when we receive breach reports, for instance, by companies, and we think that automation can help increasing efficiency in reviewing these reports. At the end of the day, though, I think the greater use and the huge acceleration of technology in recent years, and particularly due to the pandemic, means that we have many more issues to examine. So I would say overall, there's a need to increase resources, but yes, we're doing what we can to increase efficiencies.
Well, I think we live in a very exciting time in many ways.
Indeed.
But the requirement and the questions that I get at my office about personal privacy and data collection seem to be becoming more and more important as time goes on. You mentioned that there was a increase of 15% with the budget this year, and you are preparing for legislative changes. You mentioned C11, and one of your comments I found a little bit curious. You mentioned that you do make your briefs available on the website, but you did mention that the brief on C11 was not on the website. Was there any issue of why that was it's not on the website, or
it's simply due to the fact that I have not been called to testify on Bill C11 yet, and I'm waiting for members of Parliament to send me an invitation. So we're ready to go, and as soon as we have a request from members of Parliament, we will be very glad to oblige and put this up on our website.
Excellent, very good. I'm hearing more and more from people that this field, especially in the digital media, is innovating so quickly. There is a difficulty for regulators actually to keep up. You did mention that because of things moving so quickly and new legislation, that you could foresee the requirement for more resources in your office. Are you? Do you have any thoughts on that? How much that might include for the taxpayer?
As I mentioned in my statement, first of all, I need to acknowledge that in the economic statement of last fall, there were, I believe, something in the order of $18 million annually that were set aside in that quasi-budgetary document, but not only for the OPC, for all of the government institutions who will be called upon to implement Bill C-11. So we will have a share of that. That amount was arrived at after consultation with our office before we saw Bill C-11. Now that we do see Bill C-11, and particularly our role in terms of approving codes of practice by industry and to give advice upon request by companies about their privacy programs. We did not know that when we gave our estimates to the government. Now that we do know that, I can say that there will be increased funding required. But beyond increased funding, I would repeat the point I made in my statement. That is, we are totally welcoming of the role given to us by Bill C-11 on codes and advice to companies. But frankly, we cannot do that for each and every request that we will receive, which is why I think we do want to engage with business in that regard. Some additional funds will be required, but we also need to have discretion to manage our workload and to continue what we have done until now, which is to offer our services, but not have to answer each and every request, but deal with those that seem to raise the higher privacy risks, for instance. So in part money, in part discretion for us to say yes to most, but no to others if our budget cannot accommodate this.
Thank you, Mr. Curry. We're going to turn to Mr. Fergus now for the next questions. Mr. Fergus.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I would like to thank Mr. Terrien for his presentation and for coming before us at the committee today. I was very struck by what you said, and my first question is very simple, but it will take me further to other questions. My first is with respect to the pandemic. Did the pandemic have important impacts on the resources of your office? Well, in one word, yes. How would you please tell us more? Well, yes, there were impacts. For one thing, the pandemic, even before the pandemic, there's been the digital revolution, and the pandemic meant that there was an explosion of this revolution, this digital revolution. And so both in the business world as well as in the government world, everyone needed to turn to digital operations, and we had to ensure that all of that respected the Privacy Act. So there were many people that turned to us, and there's a group in Toronto that gives advice to companies all across Canada. And we also have different departments of the federal government and the Department of Health, especially, and other departments that came to us to get our advice with respect to new programs that needed to be created very quickly during the pandemic to ensure that it was done respecting privacy. Question. Yes. Well, this brings me to my second question. When I read the plan for your office's future work, you're saying that you're going to be continuing to do investigations in order to be able to investigate everything that will affect the private life, whether it's in industry or elsewhere. But I'd like to quote you. You're saying where the resources can allow it, to quote you. So how do your resources, how does that limit to your office with its investigations and its initiatives? Well, the subjects that could be investigated, well, there are many of them, and so we need to ensure that our resources are used with investigations where there is the most risk. For example, we have started an investigation with respect to the use of AI in the world of employment, and that seemed very important, that there were important risks for candidates for employment, and so we did launch that investigation. And I think the difficulties that mean that we need to make choices, all departments, well, we don't have an unlimited funding, and our budgets have limitations, so it's normal that these limits are there due to this financial limitation. So we do try to ensure that we do a risk analysis, and generally speaking, our activities are investigations where we will take the initiative, and then there are others where there may be complaints. It could be individual complaints, and it's important to respond to that. We are a mechanism where citizens can have access to justice, but the citizens do not necessarily have knowledge of the most risky practices for their privacy issues. So we have to be able to initiate our own investigations. We have to work on two fronts, and we have to have a proactive role to be able to give advice to departments as well as to businesses, and to put out advice. And so we have a role for advising companies, and all of that is fine. However, well, because of the digital revolution, it takes more funds, and so we're doing a quantitative analysis as to our needs. And as I was saying, we will need to have a capacity to, we'll have to say no to some requests because of financial situations. I have 1 minute left, so I have one last question. Maybe it'll be easier to answer that question, so I do hope you'll be able to answer easily. What do you see in terms of percentage of increase that you would need to your budget, so that you would be able to do your work reasonably well over the next 3 years? Well, I will say that for our work with the private sector, we need roughly 50%. And above and beyond that, there are new roles that will be given us if the department's reforms for the public sector do come to fruition and not too far away. I think that we would need an increase of budget, and of course Parliament will be evaluating our needs, but we're talking about a substantial increase because of two factors: the acceleration of the digital revolution and the issues that arise from that, and also the new responsibilities that we are being given because of the bill in question. Thank you very much, Mr. Therrien.
Thank you, Mr. Fergus. We're going to turn to Mr. Fortin. Monsieur Fortin.
Merci, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Hello, Mr. Therrien. I heard you answering Mr. Fergus, and your answers were surprising to me, and so I wondered if we should not be concerned. At the last question, you answered that you needed a necessary increase in terms of meeting your budget for the private sector was 50%. So you're going to need 50% increase to be able to respect your mandate? Answer. This is the additional mandate that we will have because of C11. And if we forget to Bill C11, setting that aside, as the situation is right now, do you have enough funding to be able to respect your mandate regardless of C11, putting that aside? Answer. Well, there is always this question of the digital revolution that means that we need to give more advice and that we need to have more counsel that is put out, more advice. So we do have guiding principles for countries. We have guides. They don't have the force of law, but through consultation, we have identified 30 subjects where we need guiding principles with respect to respecting privacy rights. And we haven't made it even halfway through those. And so we do have a budget increase, and we did get a budgetary increase, and we look at all of our activities. We were not able to update the guiding principles for companies and for individuals because there are just too many new questions in the digital environment that we're not able to give advice as we should be able to do. Question, and you have already said this, but you're saying that the situation with the pandemic really didn't help at all, that there's much more communication through social media and through Zoom, such as the meeting this morning, which would normally happen in person on the Hill. And so I would suspect that this gives your office quite a challenge. Could you tell us of the type of challenge that you have to deal with given this new context, this pandemic context? Answer. Well, it comes in different forms. As I was telling Mr. Fergus, there are many companies and departments and government agencies that are asking our advice with respect to initiatives, pandemic-related initiatives. That's one thing. And also you have to be able to keep up with the use of technology during the pandemic. And so the pandemic means that a lot of services are now being delivered, whether it's education, whether it's health services. They're now using technology to a much greater extent. So how to do that, respecting confidentiality of information that is put onto digital platforms. We look at that issue, and there are investigations. There are things we see that really need to be investigated. For example, as I was saying earlier, the use of AI, artificial intelligence, for interviews, employment, job interviews. And so our work is at different levels, and we're trying to use our budgets, taking into consideration the risk evaluation. And given budget restrictions, and that you don't necessarily have all of the funds that you would need, is there and a type of criteria to decide where you say no? For example, if you had certain updates for guidance that you weren't able to do. So how do you make decisions as to what you'll be acting on and what you have to set aside for now? Well, we do a risk evaluation with respect to the environment we see, and also within the context where we have to look at the legislation in place and the new bill. And so that means that we do need to investigate when complaints come to us. So when a complaint is made by a citizen, except for rare exceptions, we have to investigate. This is a real constraint and an obligation with respect to the established by the legislation. So we act as an ombudsman that can work in a very accelerated fashion. So I do understand that, but it does create a real constraint when you have to investigate every single complaint that comes to us. I think we should have a bit more leeway as other regulators have with respect to the privacy issues. And that brings me to the question, well, what would be the rights, what type of recourse would people have if we're not able to investigate a given complaint? And C11 talks about the right for private actions before the courts. So this is a real constraint as to having to make go ahead with an investigation for every complaint. Question: could you say that it's a question of funding? Well, yes, basically yes. Thank you, Mr. Terrien. Is my time up, Mr. Chair? Yes.
And so we're going to turn to Mr. Angus now. Mr. Angus, we'll turn to you for the next questions.
Thank you, Mr. Terrien. It's a pleasure to have you back before our committee. As you know, we have been studying the issue of non-consent videos and photos of people being on the site Pornhub MindGeek. Are you presently involved in an investigation of whether or not they have breached the privacy rights of Canadian citizens?
Yes.
Okay, so you have undertaken an investigation then?
Yes.
Okay, and I imagine you're not able to tell us anything about your investigation.
That's correct.
I fully understand. I'm interested because one of the survivors that approached us had tried to get the RCMP to investigate. The RCMP are saying they believe in a voluntary compliance model. We have tried to see if the Attorney General's office is interested. They don't seem to be moving on this file at all, but one of the things that an RCMP officer told this survivor was that they believed Pornhub MindGeek was exempt because of their terms and conditions, the consent that exists on their website. And I know you've raised issues of the vague nature of terms of consent on websites. Would you believe that this, the fact that they have their own set of terms and consents would somehow absolve them from the Canadian privacy laws?
I'll be careful because we're investigating. I'll just note the general principle that consent is generally required to collect, use, and disclose personal information under Canadian private sector privacy laws. And even if consent is given, there's a further rule which provides that even if consent is provided, a company cannot collect, use, and disclose information if a reasonable person would find that inappropriate.
Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate, and I understand that you are investigating, so I won't ask you any more on that. I just had wanted to clarify that. In the last Parliament, our committee sent Parliament, the government, a number of recommendations on strengthening the role of your office and ensuring that we had stronger protection for Canadians' privacy rights, the rights of our citizens. I have spoken with many people in the privacy and data field who have looked at this new legislation, Bill C11, and are raising concerns that this legislation may actually hinder a number of the objectives that we'd laid out at our committee in the previous Parliament. And one of those is the issue of meaningful consent. And I see that you state that the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, quote, leaves out an important facet of our current legislation, the idea that meaningful consent requires that the person giving it understands the consequences of what they're consenting to. And you further state, we believe this law would result in less consumer control than under the current law. Can you explain your concerns?
Yes. So there's no question that Bill C11 is a comprehensive and serious attempt to address privacy issues in the digital world. But at the most general level, I would say that we think that in order to provide adequate protection for privacy, the bill needs very significant changes. Why? In part because we think that even though there are provisions on consent in Bill C11, the ultimate impact would be less control for individuals, in part for the reason that you suggest, that is a requirement in the current law that individuals, that consumers understand the consequences of what they are being asked to consent to, that requirement would not exist in Bill C-11 as drafted. There are also important exceptions to consent in Bill C-11, some of which are appropriate, but others much too broad. For instance, there's an exception to consent where it is, quote, impracticable, unquote, to obtain consent. Well, we think that such an extremely broad exception to consent makes the rule hollow. So less control for individuals, more flexibility in C-11 for organizations. We're not against additional flexibility for organizations per se, particularly when organizations want to use personal information for the public good or for a legitimate public interest. But we think that additional flexibility should come with additional accountability.
I see that. I'm running out of time here,
Okay.
so I just want to clarify on that, because I know certainly under Section 18, there's been real concern about the broad nature of so-called business activities, that whether or not it's better to establish a fiduciary responsibility that imposes the duties of loyalty of care that collect personal information, particularly when we're dealing with information of people's racial, ethnic origin, philosophical beliefs, religious beliefs, their biometrics, their genetics. Do you think we need to have a much clearer definition of the obligation to protect this information?
In short, in brief, yes. And we think that part of the solution is, yes, to give additional flexibility for companies to use information for legitimate business purposes, but within a privacy law that has a human rights foundation. That ultimately would be the most significant protection given to consumers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. We're going to turn to Monsieur Gourde. Monsieur Gourde for the next round of questions.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Therrien, for coming today. You said that you're not able to respond to all complaints and that you have to refuse certain complaints. What type of complaint wouldn't merit an investigation? Before answering the question, I would like to remind members of the committee that in other areas, this discretionary power it does exist, and it's to ensure that the offices are not subjected to too large a number of complaints to the extent that they would not be able to do their work. So we do need to be able to pursue our work. So to come back to your question, it comes to a question of risk evaluation. It's not that the complaint does not have any merit. However, there are levels of risk that are evaluated amongst complaints we receive. So there are some complaints where it only affects an individual. For that individual, it's very important, and I do agree completely that every individual does need to have access to a system of justice. But if it's a question of investigating a complaint where the result would affect just one individual with respect to another complaint, where the result would establish a broader principle that would affect a large portion of the population, well, I think that in that case, I think we need to move ahead with the second complaint that affects more people. Question that is very commendable, and we've also talked about how technology use has increased, and I would like to ask, we acknowledge that it does make some things move faster, but it does it does take a human to be able to go ahead and make advice. And to what extent do you think technology will help and increase the speediness of of your response to complaint? Well, you're very right about the fact that you do need to have a human aspect to the response to complaints. So the technology that is used, that's especially used with respect to the triage. Right now, we have to investigate all complaints, but we don't treat all complaints in the same way. Some we look at in great depth, and others we have a fast track process for other. And so technology can help when it comes to doing the initial triage between complaints where we will move ahead with the fast track and where other situations where we will do a much more in-depth investigation. But in both cases, even with the fast track, there is an individual that does need to look at the case and to give a response to that complaint. Question. It's clear that with all of the new technology platforms, we have fast track everywhere. The type of work, the way we work has changed. Things move much more quickly. However, we are exposed to transmission of confidential information. And sometimes it's done inadvertently. And so it's very important that the public gets educated. And so how do you think we can help educate Canadians to be able to have more knowledge so that their identity is protected? Well, that's important, but it goes much beyond that. It's a broader issue which is very complex, and so it's difficult for many people to understand exactly what risks they need to manage with respect to their privacy, unless they really understand all of the fundamental of technology and processing of personal information. So they need to know how technology works and also the impact that it can have on their personal information. And so nonetheless, we know the conditions of use for many websites, and so we try to do what we can, but those conditions are very complex, and I think there is a limit as to what we can do, but we do try and inform people so that they can make the best and well-informed decisions possible.
Monsieur Gourde, we're going to turn to Mr. Sobera now for the next questions. Mr. Sobera.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone, and welcome, Privacy Commissioner. In my time today, I know we were focusing on the main estimates, and what's crucial for me is that your office has the pertinent resources for you to effectively undertake your job and your mandate. And that's what's important to me. So, on that level there, those are my thoughts. But I wanted to move on to something in terms of I've read and followed your office very closely since I've been able to join this committee late last year, whenever that may be. And when it comes to meaningful consent, because we just listened to a study on what Mr. Angus referred to, and it's from May 2018. This document where it says meaningful consent is an essential element of Canadian private sector privacy legislation. Under privacy law, organizations are generally required to obtain meaningful consent for the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information. However, advances in technology and the use of lengthy, legalistic privacy policies have too often served to make the control and personal autonomy that should be enabled by consent nothing more than illusory. If I mispronounce it, I apologize. Consent should remain central, but it is necessary to breathe life into the ways in which it is obtained. Can you comment on that paragraph? It's an introductory paragraph, and I've read your March 25th, 2021 speech. I read the Clearview AI information put forward, and I still can't believe they stated that because they were not, Canadian privacy laws do not apply to its activities because the company does not have a real and substantial connection to Canada, even though they collected 3 billion images of Canadians. But they came up with that data bullet point. Can you elaborate on meaningful consent and how we need to balance that between consumer objectives and business objectives and individual objectives?
Thank you. So obviously it's a very broad question. I'll try to do justice to it in a few seconds or minutes. consent is a fundamental aspect of the current law PIPEDA, and it will continue to have a central role under the CPPA, under Bill C-11. So there is a place for consent in privacy in 2021. So there needs to be some rules to make sure that where it works, when consent does work, that it is obtained in a meaningful way. And that means, in my view, in part, to ensure that the consumer that provides consent has a good idea of what they are consenting to, which is not obvious. So that's where consent does work. There are, as I was saying in the documents you were referring to, given where we are with digital developments, there are many situations, there are a growing list of situations where consent does not really work. Particularly when you think of artificial intelligence, for instance, where the purpose of the technology is to use information for purposes other than that for which it was obtained, that's not really conducive to consent being an adequate means to protect privacy. So given where we are in 2021 and following years, there's a role for consent, but we also need to have laws that acknowledge that consent will not always work. And then we need to find an adequate means of protecting privacy absent consent. And that's where the real difficulty, I think, lies in the discussion of these issues, particularly with Bill C-11. So Bill C-11 has many more exceptions to consent, some appropriate, others too broad in our view. How do you protect privacy if consent is not the preferred means of protecting it? We propose a human rights approach to privacy protection. Other models are proposed, such as the fiduciary model that Mr. Angus was referring to. The extremely difficult challenge is ahead of Parliament in the next few months, is to determine where consent does not work, and it does not always work, what would be a good model to continue to protect privacy adequately absent consent?
Mr. Chair, if I can just finish off, Chair, because I know
you have but seconds, so if it's
okay,
a short question.
This discussion is important to 38 million individuals in this country because this is individuals' data. This is not anyone else's data. This is individuals' data. That's the way I view this issue. And we need to make sure we get the balance right, but we need to make sure that consumers, citizens, Canadian citizens are protected. And that is my fundamental belief.
Yeah,
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you for that answer.
Thank you.
We're going to turn to Monsieur Fortin now for the next 2.5 minutes. Monsieur Fortin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Therrien, we have just 2.5 minutes, so I think I'm going to ask you a question and I'll let you elaborate on it. I'm curious, after everything that's been said up until now, and we've just touched on the subject, but how would you place Canada in comparison with other countries with respect to the protection of privacy and personal information? How would you do a comparative analysis in 2 minutes? Well, I would say that Canada has already been a leader when it comes to privacy protection, but that unfortunately we are no longer a leader. There are many other countries, and not simply in Europe, but also in South America, in Asia, countries that have innovated. Singapore, South Korea, for example, where there is legislation that protects privacy in a much better way than we have done here in Canada. And I think that it would be important over the next few months that with the bill that is to be adopted by the House of Commons, that it will bring Canada at least up to the same level of protection for personal information as other countries that are able to innovate. Often we say protective measures for privacy are too strict and that they stop innovation, but there are different countries, Germany, Singapore, South Korea, who have shown very clearly that it is possible to have legislation that will protect privacy in a good fashion and that will still move ahead with innovation. And I would say that that legislation that best protects privacy will have an effect of increasing the trust of the consumer, which is an important factor to help the economy of a country. So I do see a link between the protection of privacy, trust, and economic growth. Question, how is it that Canada lost its position as a leader in this area? I think that I may not be the best person to answer that question. Okay, well, what...
Time is up, but if you had... you'll have a chance to speak to the commissioner again when we start the next round in the next hour of the meeting. Mr. Angus, we're going to turn now to you for I think what will be the final questions of this hour, and then we'll suspend and hear from the commissioner again.
Thank you so much. I want to begin by saying I am in complete agreement with my colleague, Mr. Sorbera, on the importance of getting C11 right, because it is about the rights of 38 million Canadians, and we all have that obligation. Our committee previously had brought forward a number of recommendations about the order-making powers to the Privacy Commissioner, as well as the need to be able to levy huge fines. The vast majority of infringements, we believe, on privacy are, accidental or without, malice. But we do have some bad operators. We had Facebook say they didn't feel complied to follow Canadian law. We certainly see with Clearview AI their same instance. So the need to give you more tools was clear. What concerns me when I look at C11 is this idea of creating this regulatory tribunal that these companies could then go to complain about a decision. I'm not sure. I'd like to ask you, number one, if we have any example of this kind of regulatory tribunal that can override a privacy commissioner's decision in any other jurisdiction, and how you feel of it, because I see that you state that you believe that this tribunal would actually encourage companies to choose the route of appeal rather than finding common ground with the privacy commissioner's decisions, and it would actually delay and obstruct justice for consumers and privacy rights. Could you just give your thoughts on this regulatory tribunal balloon that has been floated by the government?
So I am concerned with the creation of this additional layer in the process. It is where I'm concerned, obviously not because I'm concerned with the issue of fairness towards companies who would be the subject of order making. I totally, obviously, get the point that it is important that the system as a whole provide fairness to complainants and to companies. But to our knowledge, there is no other jurisdiction that has this additional layer between the commissioner, the privacy commissioner, and the courts. We think that the courts are perfectly capable of reviewing our processes to ensure that companies are dealt with fairly. Now, the end result of the creation of this tribunal, as I've said and as you've noted, is that rather than have a conversation between us and a company where at the first opportunity we try to make things right, companies would be encouraged to use these avenues of redress, and which would considerably lengthen the process, which would be a huge issue for citizens.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Thank you, Commissioner Therrien. We appreciate the testimony that you provided in this first hour and for as we review the estimates. We are going to suspend now, colleagues, for before the second hour. The second hour, of course, we're going to have the commissioner back, and we're going to have, but we have to change out some of the additional witnesses. So we will now suspend for 5 minutes, and hopefully we can return for the second hour in approximately 5 minutes. Meetings. Hour of this meeting time, we do have a study that we're launching with regards to the facial recognition software and the related concerns with regards to that. And so today we have the commissioner who has agreed to remain here for an additional hour so that he can answer some questions as we launch into the investigation into this matter. So thank you, Commissioner, for remaining with us. We have Mr. Holman, who is remaining with us as well. But we do have Laura Eves, who's the Executive Director, Policy Research and Parliamentary Affairs Directorate, who is joining us for the second hour. Thank you so much for being here. And Regan Morris, who is joining us as legal counsel. Thank you as well for being here. Commissioner, I'll turn it back to you for an opening statement to allow for you to I guess, begin the discussion, and then we'll have questions for you.
Thank you. Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Alors, la technologie de reconnaissance faciale est...
Facial recognition technology has emerged as a powerful tool that, as we saw in the Clearview AI case, it can identify one person in a database of billions of photos or among thousands of protesters. If used responsibly and in the right circumstances, it can offer significant benefits to society. For example, in law enforcement, facial recognition can assist police in solving crimes or finding missing persons. At the same time, it involves sensitive personal information that is unique to the individual and is permanent. Facial recognition technology has the potential to be extremely invasive for privacy. It can enable widespread surveillance, provide biased results, and erode other human rights. A recent joint investigation of 3 of my provincial counterparts into Clearview AI shows how facial recognition technologies can lead to mass surveillance and other harms, and to treat billions of innocent people as potential suspects. Despite our findings that Clearview's activities violated Canadian privacy laws, the company refused to follow a recommendation such as to delete Canadians' photos. My office is also investigating the RCMP's use of Clearview AI. This investigation is nearing completion. We are also working with provincial and territorial colleagues to develop guidance for law enforcement agencies on the use of facial recognition technologies, and expect to publish a draft for consultation in the coming weeks.
It's how citizens are vulnerable to mass surveillance, facilitated by the use of facial recognition technology. This is not the kind of society we want to live in. The freedom to live and develop free from surveillance is a fundamental human right. Individuals do not forego their rights merely by participating in the world in ways that may reveal their face to others or enable their image to be captured on camera. The right to privacy is a prior condition to the exercise of other rights in our society. Poorly regulated uses of facial recognition technology therefore not only pose serious risks to privacy rights, but also impact the ability to exercise other rights, such as freedom of expression and association, equality, and democracy. We must ensure that our laws are up to par and that they impose limits to ensure respect for fundamental rights when this technology is used. To effectively regulate facial recognition technologies, we need stronger protections in our privacy laws, including a rights-based approach to privacy, meaningful accountability measures, and stronger enforcement powers, among others. The federal government recently introduced 2 proposals to modernize our privacy laws. These are important opportunities to better regulate the use of facial recognition and other new technologies. Last November, the Department of Justice released a comprehensive and promising consultation paper that outlined numerous proposals to improve privacy legislation in the federal public sector. It proposes enhanced accountability requirements and measures aimed at providing meaningful oversight and quick and effective remedies. It also proposes a stronger collection threshold, which would require institutions to consider a number of factors to determine if the collection of personal information is, quote, reasonably required, unquote, to achieve a specific purpose, such as ensuring the expected benefits are balanced against the privacy intrusiveness so that collection is fair, not arbitrary, and is proportionate in scope. In the private sector, Bill C-11 would introduce the Consumer Privacy Protection Act. In my view, as I've stated in the last hearing, that bill requires significant amendments to reduce the risks of facial recognition technology. The significant risks posed by facial recognition technology make it abundantly clear that the rights and values of citizens must be protected by a strong rights-based legislative framework. The Department of Justice proposes adding a purpose clause to the Privacy Act that specifies that one of the key objectives of the legislation is, quote, protecting individuals' human dignity, personal autonomy, and self-determination, end quote, recognizing the broad scope of the right to privacy as a human right. Conversely, Bill C-11 maintains that privacy and commercial interests are competing interests that must be balanced. In fact, compared to the current law in the private sector, PIPEDA, the bill gives more weight to commercial interests by adding new commercial factors to be considered in the balance without adding any reference to the lessons of the past 20 years on technology's disruption of rights. Clearview was able to rely on the language of the current federal act, PIPEDA, to argue that its purposes were appropriate and the balance should favor the company's interests rather than privacy. Although we rejected these arguments in our decision, some legal commentators have suggested that our findings would be a way to circumvent PIPEDA's purpose clause by not giving sufficient weight to commercial interests. So even though we found that Clearview breached PIPEDA, a number of commentators, including the company, but not limited to the company, are saying that we actually misapplied the current purpose clause. If C-11 were passed in its current form, Clearview and these commentators could still make these arguments, buttressed by a purpose clause that gives more weight to commercial factors. I urge you to make clear in Bill C-11 that where there is a conflict between commercial objectives and privacy protection, Canadians' privacy rights should prevail. Our submission analyzing this bill makes specific recommendations on a text that would achieve this goal. Les mesures de responsabilité démontrable.
Demonstrable accountability measures are another fundamental mechanism to protect Canadians from the risks posed by facial recognition. Key aspects of a meaningful accountability framework would include a requirement for privacy by design and to conduct private impacts assessments, as well as objections for what is known as traceability for automated decision-making. While most of these accountability measures are part of Justice's proposals for modernizing the Privacy Act, they are all absent from BC 11. Efforts to regulate facial recognition technologies must also include strong compliance mechanisms that provide quick and effective remedies for individuals. Our investigation into Clearview revealed that the organization had contravened two obligations under Canadian privacy law. On the one hand, it collected and used and disclosed biometric information without consent and for inappropriate purpose. Remarkably and shockingly, the new administrative penalty regime created by Bill C-11 would not apply to these and other important violations of the legislation. Such a penalty regime renders meaningless laws that are supposed to protect citizens. I therefore urge you to amend the bill to remedy this fundamental flaw. In conclusion, the nature of the risks posed by facial recognition technology calls for collective reflection on the limits of acceptable use of this technology. These limits should not be defined not only by the risk associated with specific spatial recognition initiatives, but by taking into account the aggregate effects of all such initiatives over time. In the face of ever-increasing technological capabilities to intrude upon our private lives, we need to ask ourselves, what are the expectations we should be setting now for the future of privacy protection. I welcome any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Colleagues, I just want you to be aware that I'm expecting, or we should be expecting, that there might be a vote in the House of Commons. The bells may start as early as 12:35, and so unless there's objection at that point in time, I will assume unanimous consent to continue through the questions, but we will ensure that sufficient time is allowed for members to log in so that at 1:05, when the vote is, members are logged in and able to vote. And so unless I get objection from committee members, will continue with the questioning. We will begin with Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, we'll begin with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Therrien, I just want to thank you for your wisdom with C11 coming down the pipe. It's so important that we lean one way versus the other way. And I know facial recognition, you know, when you first see it, it's so cool. You know, we all heard about the issue with Cadillac Fairview and the shopping mall issue, and maybe we'll get to that today. But even things like Facebook, you know, they have these tag suggestions and they put it on as default settings. They're collecting our data, our face, and many times people are totally unaware of it. And that's kind of where I wanted to start our conversation today. I come from Oshawa. And Oshawa is one of those communities that historically we built cars, we sent people back and forth across the border, things along those lines. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about international utilization of facial recognition. And I know I've heard that border efficiencies could be improved. I was wondering if you could comment on the opportunity perhaps with these. Could we opt in, opt out options if we're going back and forth across borders for businesses, individuals? And as such, are there any international conversations about, you know, the rights to delete and destroy information that may be gathered from Canadians as they cross borders into other countries?
I hope I will answer the question by going back to the point that I made early in my statement, that facial recognition can serve society. At the border, for instance, it can greatly accelerate and make more efficient the triage of individuals who wish to cross the border. And in police and law enforcement, it can facilitate the resolution of crimes or find missing persons. So I would not start from the premise that facial recognition should be banned, certainly completely, or even in certain sectors completely, like in law enforcement, for instance. So it can be useful. But it is very special in that it collects attributes of a person that are immutable. So if there's a breach of that information in the company or the government department that has collected it, you cannot change your biometrics like you can change a password. It is immutable. And that means that this particular technology needs to be regulated very rigorously so that it does bear fruit and provides benefits to society without creating nightmares for individuals who, again, can no longer protect their privacy if someone has their biometrics, including facial recognition, to nefarious ends. So that would be my answer for the border. It should be, yeah.
It's a good answer. And I sat on international trade, and we just completed the Canada-US, or the CUSMA agreement. And I was just wondering, as we move through this process, with a framework of our trade agreements, do you have any thoughts about ensuring Canadians have their rights looked after when we enter into these trade agreements? And do you think the CUSMA has sufficient, basically, protections in it.
That's a huge issue.
I know, yeah. That's why you get the big bucks.
So I would say that when comes the time to share personal information outside Canada and still do it in a privacy protective way, I think there needs to be additional safeguards to those that apply within Canada, because the risks to privacy are not the same when the data leaves the country. This does not mean that we should live in a data localization world where the data of Canadians does not leave Canada. But I think it's important to acknowledge that the risks when the data leaves Canada are higher. Then, of course, comes the question of what additional protection should come in these situations, because we live in an interconnected world. We're a neighbor to the United States. It's a reality that data often moves to the United States. I'm afraid I won't give an opinion on whether CUSMA adequately does that. I would leave it at it's not a benign issue whether data leaves Canada, and we should think hard about what additional protections should be created by Parliament to ensure that privacy continues to be protected when it does leave Canada.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Maybe another time I'll ask you about China, and that might be a more interesting conversation. Thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Carey. We'll go to Mr. Dong next. I believe Mr. Dong is next.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank the Commissioner and your staff for agreeing staying longer to answer some of the very important questions. I had some questions prepared, but after your opening statement, I have a few others added to the list. So first of all, there has been a lot of discussion, our committee included, with regard to facial recognition technology could be potentially more harmful to racialized communities. In your findings, is there any evidence to that?
There's certainly a lot of literature and analysis by academics and experts on this question. We have not actually made findings on this in the context of Clearview AI, but we have read a lot of very credible scientific research that is concerned with whether the technology is sufficiently precise, particularly in the case of racialized communities, to be used in a way that does not violate not only privacy, but other rights like equality rights. There are concerns about this. From a privacy perspective, the issue would be that facial recognition needs to be used in a way where accurate information is collected. The principle of accuracy is one of the important privacy principles. And again, there's a lot of literature to the effect that for racialized communities, the information collected may not always be accurate depending on the technology in question.
Right. So without any empirical evidence that facial recognition technology could be harmful, particularly to a racialized community, is there anything in Bill C-11 that we can do to provide guardrail to make sure the vulnerable community don't get harmed as facial recognition technology develops?
So Bill C-11, as mentioned, does not have a human rights approach to the privacy law in question. It would be very beneficial if the if the CPPA, the proposed CPPA, had a human rights foundation, because then, say, the principle of accuracy that I just alluded to could be used to ensure that potential discrimination against populations in the use of facial recognition would be part of our remit to ensure that under privacy principles, technology that would result in discrimination would be found contrary to privacy. I'll say that some would argue that these issues should be addressed through human rights legislation, and certainly that's a credible point. I would say that in the virtual world, as in the physical world, the fact that there's some overlap in the jurisdiction of regulators, so as between my office and the Canadian Human Rights Commission, is not a bad thing, so long as the regulators speak to one another, are efficient, and benefit from each other's expertise. Our model would be to have a human rights approach to privacy law.
I see. That's a very good point. You mentioned that the facial recognition technology could be beneficial to our law enforcement system. Do you have any thoughts on what process are in place or should be in place to ensure that the government of Canada has the public trust in utilizing facial recognition?
I'll say something at the general level because we have not completed our investigation of the RCMP, but the issue you raise is central. And obviously, whether it's companies or government departments, including law enforcement agencies that use facial recognition, should have processes to, ahead of implementation of these technologies, to assess the impact that they may have in order to ensure that privacy is respected. That's a central part, I think, before the technology is actually put into place.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I want to get my next question in. Does your office currently have enough resource to dive deeper on whether it's the algorithm or data storage or process to access data? This type of investigation, does your office currently have enough resource to do that? And not just with the money. I mean, also talking about technically
the nature of our expertise.
Yeah.
So we do have a group of technologists, roughly 12 individuals who are experts in technology. They assist in our policy development, but also in our investigative activities. So in terms of the kind of people, I think we have the right people. Then there's the question of how many resources, and that was the subject of some discussion in the last hour.
You mentioned a partnership between the federal government and the provincial government. What in your mind, what would be the jurisdictional divide between the provincial and the federal system?
As to facial recognition?
As to the legislative aspect of facial recognition.
The same jurisdictional divide as for other technologies. So there's a federal private sector law which governs the private sector when provinces have not legislated. Obviously, provinces would legislate the conditions under which their own officials would use facial recognition. So the same jurisdictional issues would arise here as with other technologies.
Thank you, Mr. Doan. We'll turn to Monsieur Fortin now for the next round of questions. Monsieur Fortin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Therrien, the more I listen to your testimony, the more I realize that this is really a huge job we have ahead of us with C11. when it comes to protecting privacy. I think this is something that concerns everyone, at least here in Quebec, and I would imagine it's the same thing elsewhere in Canada and around the world for that matter. I'm a little concerned with respect to what you're saying about C11 that would not cover every aspect of privacy, and I would note that you have warned us about the fact that facial recognition data is immutable, and once it's there, it'll be there forever. And also there's the question of exchanges and information sharing between countries, and we have to be careful because the protections aren't the same in every country. And so at the time, in the era that we're living right now, I think that exchange is happening more and more. And so I think that we have to be even more careful. And this is a certain number of concerns that we have. So my question, Mr. Therrien, for you is that when C11 was being prepared, were you involved? Were you asked to advise and so that you'd be able to suggest the inclusion of these protective measures that seem to not be in C11 right now? So was a report given at the time? Answer. Publicly, we did make several reports recommending a human rights base to the reform for the legislation. We made several reports to that effect to Parliament, and we had a certain number of exchanges with the people at the Innovation Department and people that were working on this bill, but we did not see it until it was tabled. So the cabinet confidentiality limited the exchanges that we had with the department in question when it came to the preparation of the bill. However, they were aware of our position. It was in a public report that was tabled in Parliament and elsewhere. But I must say that I'm disappointed that such a bill has been tabled, a bill that does not take into consideration the fact that there's such a gap between what the regulator thinks is important in terms of protections and the bill that has been tabled. Question. If you were asked, would you be able to propose a series of amendments that would improve the protection of privacy? Is that something that could be done, that we could ask you for amendments? It's more than suggested. We prepared a brief and we worked very hard to analyze the bill in all of its aspects, and we have a brief that is ready if members want to see it. It does the analysis of the bill, and it does make a good number of recommendations. Question. Well, I would say yes, I'm very interested in seeing it. So I think that everybody here would be interested in seeing it. I would not imagine anybody would not want to see it. So would you be able to send us a copy, Mr. Therrien? Yes. If the committee makes the request, I would be very pleased to share that with you. Mr. Chair, I would like to make the request officially right now, if my colleagues agree, that we would be able to have a copy of this brief. Is that fine, Mr. Chair?
That he'd make it available, so I think that we as a committee would be happy to accept anything the Commissioner would provide for us.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci, Monsieur Therrien.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Therrien. One last thing, Mr. Therrien. The report on the investigation of Clearview, you say that it's almost completed. At what point in time might we be able to see the report? Answer. This investigation is completed. This is an investigation that is coming to its end, and the last portion is with respect to the RCMP and their use of the Clearview software. So we should be able to complete the report within a week or so. Yes, before we stop for the summer. Thank you. Question. I would like to come back to the question earlier. I was talking about other countries, Singapore, South Korea, Germany. How are they ahead of Canada when it comes to protecting privacy? Answer: it depends on the jurisdiction but in Europe and elsewhere, in a certain Latin American country, in Japan and in South Korea, the approach that we're suggesting that is to have the basis of protections based on human rights. That is what exists, and there are also important penalties, so that the consumer can trust that their information is being protected. Their private information is protected. As a member was saying earlier, there are many companies that respect privacy, but there are others that really need to be brought in and to be corrected, and important and heavy penalties would be a good tool. So infringements such as Clearview that has done with C11, there would be no administrative penalty, which is really hard to understand. So I think heavy penalties and an approach based on human rights, I think, and more of a flexibility with respect to the use of data, but with more responsibility for the companies. That would mean that the regulator would, not in an arbitrary fashion, but based on their evaluation of the environment, that they would be able to do proactive investigations and not wait for infringement to occur. So they would be able to be proactive, and that I think is very important if we want to protect privacy and personal information. Question.
Angus, Mr. Angus. Mr. Angus, I think you're still on mute. We'll start you again.
Thank you very much. Mr. Therrien, when we first learned of the Clearview AI case, it seemed to be, the worst possible scenario. Here we had this company that scraped millions and millions of photos of Canadians without their consent. Our kids' birthday parties, our backyard barbecues, us at work, and then created a database that they were selling to all manner of organizations. They claim it was for police, but we know individual police officers without oversight had it. We know that a billionaire, John Katsimatidis, used it to target his daughter's boyfriend. You launched an investigation. Clearview AI, their attitude was, hey, too bad, so sad, you're just Canadians. We don't even feel we're obligated to follow the law. So we have a new law, C11, come in, and my understanding, my gut feeling was that the C11 would fix these things so that we would have more powers, that we'd be able to target these companies to make them respect law. Are you telling us that under C11, the weight of support would actually go to rogue outliers like Clearview AI over the rights of citizens? And are you saying that the monetary penalties that we've been told about that would, ensure compliance, that a company like Clearview AI would be completely exempt from that? Is that what we're seeing under this new law?
There are two main mechanisms that are relevant to Clearview's situation under CPPA. The first one is the purpose clause, so section 5 of the CPPA, which confirms the PIPEDA's approach to balance commercial interests with privacy considerations. That clause does not say that privacy is a human right, and that clause adds a number of commercial factors to the current law compared to the current law. So there would be a balancing exercise, but with the likelihood of greater weight given to commercial factors than under the current PIPEDA, point one. Point two, assuming that it would be inconsistent with the CPPA for Clearview to do what they did, there's an administrative penalty scheme under C11 and a criminal penalty scheme under C11. The administrative penalty scheme is limited to an extremely narrow slice of violations of the CPPA and violations having to do with form of consent, with the understanding requirement that I referred to before, with whether Clearview had the right balance between commercial interests and human rights. All of that is not, cannot be the subject of administrative penalties under the CPPA. In order for penalties to apply, I would have the office would have to, one, make a finding, which would take about 2 years, two, make an order. The tribunal would need to then decide whether to impose, penalty would be excluded. So the tribunal would sit in appeal of our order, assuming the company would still not comply with the order. Then it is the fact that the company would not comply with an order several years after it has been made that would be the subject of criminal penalties, and the criminal courts would be involved. So a very protracted process leading to penalties, we think something like 7 years after the facts.
Wow.
As opposed to what should be happening, we think, which is that we should be able to impose penalties, of course, subject to court review for fairness considerations vis-a-vis companies. And we think that the delay would be roughly 2 years in that model compared to the model in C11.
Okay, I think this is really important because I think most Canadians would agree the Clearview AI situation was very concerning, and we could see many, many more examples of this as this technology becomes more commonplace. And yet we have a legislation that seems to be going backwards, willing to protect the Clearview AIs rather than citizens. I ask this because we have C10, which should have been a pretty straightforward bill about making the tech giants pay their part, and instead it's turned into this legislative dumpster fire with the minister running around looking like a chicken with his head cut off. The issue of privacy rights was something that our committee had brought forward really clear recommendations for. What you're telling us with Clearview AI is that this law is actually not taking the lessons that we learned on issues like facial recognition, and not lessons that we've learned from the big data giants ignoring their obligations under Canadian law, but actually writing in more protections for that abuse because we're not looking at it in a human rights frame. Is that correct?
I think very, very significant amendments to Bill C11 should be made to adequately protect privacy.
Thank you. Do I have any time left?
You do have 30 seconds left, or 20 seconds left.
Okay, I just want to follow up then in terms of the RCMP investigation. RCMP refused to tell the Canadian public whether they were using this technology at all. Are you looking at laws that would ensure compliance of our police services with companies like Clearview AI?
My report will address that theme generally. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll turn to Monsieur Gord now for the next round of questions. Monsieur Gord.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Commissioner, one gets the idea that reality is worse than fiction here in this situation, and I think that Canadians are quite concerned with respect to living in a world where they can be recognized, filmed at any time, especially when they're in an urban situation where there are cameras on every building, at every corner. So is this really the situation? We've seen an example with Clearview AI where users of social media innocently and for socializing with friends have used social media and not knowing at all that the information that they were uploading would be used by companies such as Clearview that uses the information for supposedly for police investigation, but as we said, that sometimes it's for private investigations against individuals. So this is one of a huge concern. You're saying that there's surveillance cameras that are in public areas, that they're also a risk, an important risk. So once again, yes, facial recognition can play an important role when it comes to ensuring security in certain circumstances. So I would not say that it's really a sensitive question when it comes to its use in public areas. But I think that it's wouldn't say you have to stop it completely, but I would encourage you to ask other witnesses who will be following me. I think that the answer is that these cameras are in many different areas, and I think that we can't regulate everything. We have to look at this question with respect to values, and that brings me once again back to the human rights basis. So I think that is more true with respect to the Justice Department concerned rather than the C11. So respecting the human rights, that's one first important thing. And then you have to have a mechanism to balance commercial uses and human rights, and that things be better balanced than what we're seeing in C11. And we will be making recommendations. And one last point. Our legislation now in Canada and elsewhere, it's not the case everywhere, but in some countries, the legislation is supposedly neutral. That is, that the principles are applied to whatever the technology, including facial recognition and biometrics. So the advantage of that, and I'm not saying that that aspect of our legislation should be set aside, but I do think that there is a question that you really should be looking at, in my opinion, is should we constrain certain activities of facial recognition that they be prohibited or that they be subject to more rigorous restriction or legislation. And I would like to suggest that in April you take a look at the European Commission's publication with respect to artificial intelligence, where certain prohibited practices are defined, and facial recognition directly in certain public areas, except for in exceptional cases, when it is an investigation of an important crime such as a terrorist event. So this type of process for balancing human rights as well as societal needs, and also with respect to general application, I think that that is where one needs to ask whether some precise rules to prohibit or to have rigorous restriction of this technology, which is particularly possibly invasive because of the biometrics. Question: security in some extreme cases, or if there were to be abuses made, how can Canadians protect themselves, or what type of recourse do they have? We've seen that in Montreal, there were cameras that were put bought on the internet, and they were put into either toilets or showers, and sometimes people are having fun with voyeuristic activities. So what can we do in that situation?
But I'll allow you to answer the question, Commissioner.
Ça me semble assez clair que ce genre.
I think it's clear that that type of use is totally unacceptable. And the question, I think, are what type of penalties you have to have important penalties if you want to have a disincentive. And we don't see that in our legislation now or in C11.
Ms. Latantia, we'll turn to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Terrien, for your testimony this morning. Quite informative. And what I'm drawing from it is that there's a constant need of striking a balance between individual human rights, public confidence, economic growth, and it's going to be, I think, a quite, a very difficult task because, technology is forever evolving and it's going at a very fast pace. So I think that my opinion, if I can allow myself to say so, is that, I think a peace study is more than warranted as we do not know when we will get C-11. Also on the question of cross-border data, that's of interest to me because given the nature of cross-border data as it flows, it adheres to international best practices and standards, which will be instrumental for ensuring Canadian competitiveness. Is it correct in saying, and I want to go back to that European notion that you were talking about earlier, that the EU data protection regulation remains the international gold standard? And how can Canada ensure equivalency with this regulation? That would be my first question. And why is it that Canada's interest to retain the equivalency with the EU?
So the government certainly cited the desirability of Canada maintaining adequacy status in the EU as one of the impetus for Bill C-11. And indeed, maintaining adequacy is important. It allows the data flows between Canada and the EU without specific mechanisms like special contracts and the like. So clearly, for Canada to maintain adequacy is helpful to maintain freer flow of data between Canada and the EU. But beyond the EU, as I said, we live in an interconnected world, and obviously we have a neighbor to the south with whom we have very significant fundamental commercial relations. So data needs to flow there too. I think that's all good. But I think we need to, and hopefully in the context of the review of Bill C-11, we can look at ways to allow these data flows, but in a way that recognizes that when data leaves Canada, the risks are higher. So I'm not advocating for ways to prevent these data flows, but certainly in the submission that you will now be able to read, we make certain recommendations on how to enhance the protection of personal information when it does leave Canada, while allowing it.
These recommendations, we will see that in the brief that you spoke about earlier that you'll be filing? Okay.
Yes.
You also spoke about the overlapping jurisdiction with the Human Rights Commission. How about the Competition Bureau of Canada? Your colleagues there are also grappling with the new and emerging privacy issues brought about some of the changes in technology that we're seeing, including the emergence of facial recognition software. Can you describe the relationship between the two offices?
So indeed, that's another relationship that's very important. I think we have a good relationship with the Competition Bureau. Again, as I said earlier, in the virtual world as in the physical world, it's normal to have a number of regulatory agencies that share different activities from different perspectives. So it's good to have both the Competition Bureau and the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. The important thing is to ensure that the law allows a certain sharing of information between these agencies so that we can benefit from our respective expertise and also from an operational perspective can divide files according to who's best placed to handle them. But at the general level, we need to be able to cooperate with other regulators, including the Bureau. There are provisions in C-11 to facilitate that. That's a good thing. And we look forward to further cooperation with the Bureau and others.
So from a citizen perspective, how will the citizen be best guided as to where to place his or her complaint if we have an overlapping of jurisdiction between different offices?
There should not be complete overlap. Maybe I should make that clear. So the Competition Bureau has a jurisdiction over consumer protection and competition. There is some overlap with us when personal information is involved. So to that extent, I think we need to live with these overlaps. But the mandate of these various bodies should make it clear who is responsible for what. So I'm not advocating to play a role in competition law. The Bureau is well placed to do that. But privacy issues should be largely within our realm.
Thank you. We'll turn, Ms. Lattanzio, you are out of time, unfortunately, but we'll turn to Monsieur Fortin now for the next round of questions. Monsieur Fortin, you've got 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Therrien, I understand from your testimony that there are several departments that can propose bills, and in different cases they will have an impact on the privacy rights of citizens. Would it not be a good idea so that any time any department wanted to propose a bill that would affect, at least in part, privacy rights, would it not be a good idea to have a directive that would indicate that they would have to get the approval of the Privacy Commission? Would that not be something that would ensure adequate protection? That answer that we need to be consulted before departments would propose any legislative measures or administrative measures that would have an important impact on privacy. Yes, of course, that you're right. You were saying earlier, and I think that we have to realize that the responsibilities need to be balanced, so that we should be consulted, yes, and then the government does need to take that advice into consideration. I do think that's a good idea, but that the government does have the responsibility for tabling a bill, and they have the responsibility for whatever they present, so I do believe that that is clear in terms of responsibility. Question, except that now we have a Bill C-11 that is for protecting privacy, but from what I've understood, it's not complete, or at least it is inadequate. So there are a certain number of gaps, inadequacies that you could have corrected if you'd been involved from the beginning. Answer, yes. We would have liked to be able to be more involved, recognizing that it is the responsibility of the government. Question, yes, but if the information had been, if you'd been involved, that would have been better. Nonetheless, I have a few seconds that remain, but is it not a little bit late? I'm looking at the population that already have biometric information, whether or not it's on our cell phones, our passports, and now you have your fingerprint to open them, and now we have, as members, we vote with this type of facial recognition. So I think that everybody has already shared their facial biometrics. So isn't it a little bit late, Mr. Therrien, to try and stop any abuse or even to control or to hold back the problem? Answer, yes, it is late. Nonetheless, technology will continue to evolve, and I think that it is necessary for institutions, for state institutions, for parliamentarians to establish the rules for future use of this technology. And somebody is saying that 4G is complex, yes, but I think that it's important to note that the rules, well, it's a lot less complex if you really give yourself a mandate to be able to respect values and project them into the legislation for the technology, and where the technology is complex, our values evolve. And I think that what's important is that the legislation for the digital world should respect our values as a society within the legislation, and that would be a good starting point. Well, thank you very much.
We are out of time. Mr. Angus, we'll turn to you now for the next 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, and one of the things I thought was really profound in your findings against Clearview AI is that you said it would essentially subject the citizens of this country to a perpetual police lineup. What we're talking about is not dystopian science fiction. We should know as citizens that when our children go to the mall, that they aren't being photographed and being put into a database, that racialized citizens are not being targeted on the streets when they walk, that the right to go into a public place is a public right, and you should not be profiled, targeted, or put into some form of database for collection. And so the Clearview AI case was a really good opportunity for Canada to get this right because it was so egregious. And yet what you're telling us is that the laws were written in a way to protect these outlier companies, ignoring I think the growing awareness that's happening internationally. So the question is with C11, if the government is refusing to make the necessary changes to put a human rights frame onto the rights of privacy, and if they are going to insist on protecting the interests of corporations who may not have the best interests of our citizens at heart, would we be better off with the status quo than putting more weight on the side of companies and outliers like Clearview AI?
Well, first, I would not ascribe motivation to those who have tabled Bill C11 other than to try to balance commercial interests and privacy considerations.
I fully understand that. I guess I'm just asking that you say that you're concerned that after Clearview AI, they would actually have stronger, potentially legal power or ability to resist, and that's my concern.
That's my concern as well. And indeed, I think it is quite possible that a court seized with a matter like Clearview AI under CPPA would find that would not necessarily maintain the decision that we have made, in part because of the way the balancing clause of the CPPA is drafted. I find that extremely concerning, as well as the limited nature of administrative penalties under Bill C11.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Colleagues, we will move to adjourn here shortly, but I just wanted to inform colleagues that we do have 2 witnesses for the upcoming meeting. Next on this Friday, we've got I'm just reminding myself so I don't get it wrong, but we have the Information Commissioner as well as the Lobbying Commissioner confirmed for each 1 hour on the Friday meeting. Commissioner, thank you so much for joining us on these 2 important meetings, first on estimates, and then, of course, as we launch into the study on facial recognition technologies. We certainly appreciate your willingness to come and be prepared to answer on both of those, as well as our additional witnesses. Colleagues, there is a few minutes left before bell's end, but I want to adjourn this meeting to allow members to be prepared to vote and logged in when that happens. Again, Commissioner, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.